Welcome back to the Morning Blend. Harper Lee wrote To Kill a Mockingbird back in the 1960s, which sold millions of copies and won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. After that book, Lee was silent for about 50 years. She was planning to write about a famous trial involving a preacher accused of murdering 5 family members, but she never did.
That's right, and that's where our next guest comes in. She picked up the story in this New York Times bestseller called Furious Hours: Murder, Fraud, and the Last Trial of Harper Lee. Casey Cep is the author, and she joins us now with more about this fascinating drama. Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Wonderful to meet you.
Yeah, so you've been kind of obsessed with To Kill a Mockingbird since you were little.
Obsessed is a very sweet word. Yeah, it was my favorite book as a kid, and I think like a lot of young women, I just identified with Scout and really felt the story was just so incredible and so well told. So yes, a bit of a dream come true to get to write a book partly about Harper Lee herself.
No, have you written about or studied Harper Lee before this book?
You know, we were just talking about this. I think probably in school I read it at some point, but I had done a lot of reporting for The New Yorker, and that's how I found this case, and felt like it was this really untold chapter of her life, and there was this big mystery. What had she been up to after To Kill a Mockingbird? And it turns out there's a very interesting answer, at least in the 1970s, when she was hoping to write a true crime book about this story in eastern Alabama.
And kind of go through the story. We gave a teeny bit of it, the Reverend who had killed 5 of his family members, but she was there at the trial, correct?
Yeah, so she shows up in town. There was a series of murders in eastern Alabama from 1970 to 1977, all relatives of the Reverend Willie Maxwell, and all of whom he held lucrative insurance policies on. But in 1977, at the funeral of his last alleged victim, a vigilante stood up and murdered him in front of everyone there at the funeral. And that's the trial that Harper Lee came to town for. So she was interested in vigilantism, she was interested in the original crime story, and she came to town for 9 months and interviewed, you know, the law enforcement officers who had been involved, the lawyers, relatives of the victims, and she did a tremendous amount of reporting. And then the question was, whatever happened to the book she was supposed to write? So that's the first part of the book, is the mystery of the true crime story, and the last part of the book is the mystery of her life as a writer and why she was never able to publish again.
So many questions here.
I
you know, it's like I have 1,000.
That are probably going to give things away you can't answer, right?
Yeah. And for example, In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, she helped, contributed there. Right?
Yeah, so it's a fascinating story. I mean, I sometimes think about, you know, my childhood friends, and in the case of Harper Lee, it's incredible. Her childhood friend was Truman Capote. He had relatives in this tiny Alabama town where she was born and raised, and so they knew one another as children. And then many years later, when he needed someone to help him do the reporting for In Cold Blood, she came along and made several trips out to Kansas, and once again helped interview people, really helped him understand the case. There too attended a trial, and you know, really produced a lot of work that helped him write that book. So it seems like she was trying to do the same thing again when she got a hold of this trial in the 1970s. But really just, again, incredible that these two people knew one another as children and helped one another develop as writers. And I feel like it's one of the sweetest relationships in the book, that we learn about how they met and, you know, to some extent what was fraught in their friendship, because they did have a falling out later in life.
And did you say in your book you also go through the case and you kind of you go through like the actual story of it and further that story for you as a writer?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was important to me, you know, if I was going to tell you about Harper Lee's effort to write about the case, I felt like you as a reader needed to understand the facts of what had happened.
Right.
So the first 2/3 of the book just takes you through that initial murder story, and you learn about the town, you learn about the accused, you learn about one of the lawyers who was involved, and then you sit down at the very trial that Harper Lee attended and kind of day by day understand what happened. And it's only in the last third of the book that she reappears, and we get to follow her life as a writer and her work on this case, and then to the, you know, the million-dollar question, what was she up to after To Kill a Mockingbird? So that's the last third of the book.
Well, you know, it's fascinating because as a reporter, I've covered stories and even trials where you're kind of like, there's really no story here, or there's not a lot of juicy stuff. That was not the case here. I mean, there was so much material. I mean, clearly you would think, based on some of the facts of the case and how dramatic it all was and everything that happened, she had plenty to write about. I heard that she had a quote where she said something like, some people only have one book in them in a lifetime, something along those lines. I mean, clearly fans of hers think she probably had dozens
Yeah, absolutely. And look, Harper Lee knew a good story when she found one. It is true that this original crime story is just incredibly strange and strangely interesting, and would have let her talk a lot about the history of Alabama too, and about the religious history of voodoo and Baptist ministry and all sorts of interesting dimensions. So I don't really think the problem was that she couldn't find another story. You know, the world is full of them, and she was a writer, and so this is an interesting look at one that should have been able to be a book. In fact, here I am turning it into a book, and it's just the chance to think about what was hard for her as a writer. I don't think it was that she couldn't find a good story.
Do you think it was the fame and the success of her first book that?
Yeah, I mean, let me tell you.
Stunted
So
her?
I feel really lucky. You know, this book was on the New York Times bestseller list for a few weeks, and that was overwhelming and just incredible. And you know, To Kill a Mockingbird has sold 40 million copies, and it was an instant bestseller. She had never published anything before. Then the movie with Gregory Peck came out, and yes, one of the things she said over and over again is she was just overwhelmed by Mockingbird.
She also reportedly drank a lot of alcohol. We talked about alcohol earlier. How much of that is part of her story and part of her problem?
Yeah, I think that, you know, there's some folks who've read the book and found it sad because they sit with a writer they love and they want nothing more than to think she could have just secretly triumphed. And there's, you know, a lot of productivity we don't know about. And in fact, part of the book just sits with someone who struggled with drinking and struggled with depression and struggled with writer's block omnidirectionally. And I think that's hard, you know, when you sit with someone who wrote this tremendous book and you wish could have done it over and over again, and you realize some very common things were plaguing her, and drinking was unfortunately one of them.
I love that you just said omnidirectionally.
I know.
I'm gonna use that in a sentence 10 times today so I remember it. That was good stuff.
Thanks,
It's wonderful
Casey.
to meet you. I know you're from the East Coast, but it's great that you stopped by here. I know you have a signing today at 2 o'clock. It's at Boswell Book Company, which is located on North Downer Avenue in Milwaukee. Later today, if people can't catch you here, you're going to be in Winnetka. That's at 6:30 tonight at Bookstall, but people can find out more about you if they go online.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
Great to meet
Yeah.
you. Omnidirectionally.
Got it.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.